Good morning, Jill. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, very good, very good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And I'm going to start with an apology because you're a content guru and content firm CEO. So thank you for deigning to come and visit a sort of dodgy little YouTube channel filmed on a webcam. So it's somewhat embarrassing, but
My
it's great.
pleasure.
It's great to have you here. I hope it doesn't drag your brand down too much.
Oh, absolutely not. Quite the opposite.
So this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the two most important philosophical questions. What's real and how should we go about choosing what to believe in? How should we understand the universe? And who matters? So in the field of ethics, who gets our compassion? Who's in our scope of moral consideration? And I'm answering those two questions myself with an obvious bias. And the clue is in the name of this podcast in YouTube called Sentientism. And it's a simple worldview that suggests that we should use evidence and reason when trying to think about how to understand the world and choose what to believe. So a naturalistic way of understanding the world. And when it comes to our ethics, we should have a sentiocentric compassion. So we should care about all sentient beings, any being that can suffer or flourish or experience things. But I'm talking in these conversations to people who disagree and agree with different parts of that. So it will be fascinating to understand your own sort of philosophical journey and how that plays into your work too. But before we start with those questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work to people who don't know of you already?
Well, my name's Jill Ettinger. I've been pretty immersed in digital content for over a decade. Last year already, I co-founded Ethos. It's the ethos.co. And we really wanted to take a different approach to all of the ethical changes happening in the world and a little softer. I think a lot of stuff can kind of beat people over the head with you need to go vegan or you need to stop using plastic straws. And we really felt like there's a softer approach, which maybe ties into my theories on, what is real or sentientism. But prior to that, I worked predominantly in the vegan media space, but actually got my roots in the natural foods industry. I spent a really long time out of my own desire to eat healthier and more responsibly, found myself just in the whirlwind of the organic food movement and spent a lot of time doing sales and marketing there.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, and it will be great to come back to the role you see Ethos playing in trying to make the world a better place in our final question too. And I came across your work. I've seen and read a great deal of it, but I was sort of prompted to reach out after you appeared on another one of my favorite podcasts, Conspirituality. And you told part of that story about, the world of wellness and I guess both the epistemology and the ethics that can play into that world. So it'd be good to explore that with you too, as we go through these big questions.
Yeah, that was a fun one. Like Derek mentioned, he and I have been great friends for 20 years, which is hard to believe. It's kind of gone so quickly, but and there was a lot of overlap there with one of my roles working for David Wolfe.
Yeah, great, thank you. So let's start with the first of these crazily big questions. What's real? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in maybe a more supernaturally minded, religious, spiritual, mystical sort of context, family and society, or one that was more naturalistic, maybe more science-minded, more atheistic or agnostic, and how that side of their thinking has changed through their life and where they are now. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to sort of tell the story of your thinking there, but yeah.
I always say the religion that kind of governed my house was Bob Dylan. My father was and still is just a diehard fan, and any life lesson, any conversation somehow always was sent back to his lyrics or his philosophy, and which anyone who even knows him somewhat superficially is that he's both deep and also a bit flippant and kind of very challenging to a lot of conventional ways of thinking. Both my parents were raised Jewish. My father very much so an atheist, even when Dylan had like his born again Christian and all these different phases. my mother, I would call her a 7-Eleven Jew, like whenever it was convenient for her. At least I did. I have three younger siblings. I don't know if they all went to Hebrew school, but I went for a little while, and I got kicked out for taking that very antagonistic approach and just challenging a lot of the just things that were being taught that I felt were kind of ridiculous. So I did get kicked out of Hebrew school. I think it was one of my father's more proud moments. But in terms of, was there a spirituality? I think it was very much, my parents split when I was very young, and I lived with my dad. And so it was very much, you're on your own. I'm a child of the 80s. It was, you were on your own anyway. It was kind of like, let yourself into the house. And certainly he was there for any questions, but it was very much, you're on your own journey. And when in doubt, reference the Bob Dylan catalog for answers.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you. And the other biggest Bob Dylan fan I've spoken to in this interview series is the philosopher Konstantin Sandis.
Okay.
Who has done published work about Bob Dylan's life, Dylan at 80, and various other things. So he's probably the competition with your dad for the biggest Bob Dylan fan I've come across so far.
They are legion, and I'm not a fan. I think musically, there are other artists I prefer, but I certainly love and respect him as, some sort of figure in figurehead in my upbringing and in weird ways. So, in terms of what's real, I mean, I remember specifically in the 80s driving around in my dad's car, and we were listening to the Infidels album, and that really kind of made me question a lot of things that I don't think I even still have an answer of what is real. It all feels somewhat like a simulation some days. But yeah. I think as I get older, and I'm a mom now, I have a 9-year-old, it's what we decide is real. And we have to really accept that that's a hard thing to accept, that others may have other views. And, perfect examples are animals that can see like ultraviolet color. I mean, their reality is completely different from ours. So it is, the older I get, or maybe the wiser I get, I don't know, probably the older I get. Yeah. It's that it's very much a personal definition.
Yeah, thank you. And when you had that, your dad's proud moment of you getting kicked out of Hebrew school, what was the nature of the challenges? Because I've had some guests who still have a religious worldview now, but most of them have started out, like almost everybody does, with a default religious worldview, and they moved away from it. And some people moved away more because of facts and evidence and reason. This just doesn't feel real to me anymore. The evidence isn't there. And they learned about different religions and maybe inconsistencies in the religious texts and so on. So it was sort of a facts and evidence thing, or it was an ethical, moral thing where they're going, well, some of the ethics that are flowing through what I'm being told doesn't fit with the way I think the world should be, good and bad. What were the nature of your challenges to it? Was it something along those lines or something else?
It was very much we're the chosen people. And I just felt that to be an egregious statement. And at the time, I mean, there's been suffering going on in the world forever. And I just felt, how can one group be given more of a preference than another, or matter more? We're all kind of stranded here on this floating marble. And it just really struck me as not making sense at a young age. And I didn't really have a way to articulate that. And so I think my default was to just become a back talker and a very challenging person at that time, which I don't think my dad was encouraging that, like, go out and get in trouble. But I think it was the byproduct of that music that we were listening to and his worldview. And I just felt like sitting in that class, that it was was hypocritical, especially because of, if you know the history of the Jewish people, which most do, it's that they endured so much suffering and slavery and all these terrible things. And to then still hold on and cling to this ideal that they're the chosen people and others are not. And I still have issues with the religion. I mean, I still have issues with Israel and what's happening in Palestine. So that has never changed for me. I never went back to it. I mean, it just, there's something I love about the culture. And, I have great memories of sitting around the Passover table with my grandparents. And those are really precious moments. But as a way to live my life, a rule to live by, not at all. So I remember specifically, and there was also other things like this concept of this omnipresent God that was kind of directing every moment of my life. And I very much wanted the autonomy. I'm the oldest of 4 kids, so I was very much clinging to my identity and being able to be in charge of my own destiny, and felt like that, not that it was a cop-out, but it just felt like, how could I give all of my ideas and decisions over to some invisible force that I couldn't validate or prove existed?
Yeah, there's a sort of uncomfortable ask to submit in a way that doesn't fit right with many people. Yeah,
not for me. Yeah.
Oh, and one of the fascinating things that as I've explored these conversations is the prevalence of actually people with an atheistic and completely naturalistic worldview within religious communities. And my understanding from the stats and the surveys is that's particularly true of Jewish communities, is that the prevalence of atheism within Jewish communities is, a surprisingly high percentage. So there are many people who, take the ritual and the community and the positive aspects they find in the culture and community, but have abandoned both the supernatural beliefs and have also, carved out some of the ethical stuff that they don't think resonates, but have kept the commitment to the community and that sense of identity and belonging too. So it's a fascinating dynamic. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a neighborhood that is very, very Jewish. I mean, we had synagogues on every corner, and I did not know that that's not how much of the rest of the world was. It, I've not seen it really outside of 2 neighborhoods in the world, really. So, it just felt like there's a lot to like about any culture. I think, that's kind of the takeaway for me, is any culture that you're immersed in, if we're really paying attention and being involved in the world, we're going to find some great things. And that was one of the challenges, is I don't want to just cancel that entirely, because there's so much I did love, but very much the individual journey and not feeling like you have to kind of surrender your whole life to this belief. Yeah.
So as you completed that transition, some of my guests have had extremely traumatic exits from a religious worldview, and in some cases it's presented physical risk to them. Others, it's been really easy because the things just sort of faded away into the background. And I guess from what you've said, because of your own, personality and your father's way of thinking, that shift wasn't particularly difficult for you. Is that fair to say? Psychologically or socially or emotionally, or did it feel like it was a wrench or some sort of traumatic difficulty of moving away from those beliefs?
Well, it happens during the teen years, so it's extremely traumatic, but not in that way. Like, I didn't feel like I was being deprogrammed or anything like that. I think even when we were going to Hebrew school, like I said, my dad wasn't really a fan of that or involved so much. So it was very reformed and very casual. So it wasn't like I was exiting from, a Hasidic upbringing or something.
Yeah, but very different context. Yeah.
It's just that coming to terms with my own understanding of the world and how I want that relationship to be, which happened as a teen, and it of course was quite traumatic, just every day living through that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. And once you moved through that, would you have described yourself as an atheist or agnostic, or did you just find yourself in a sort of neutral space where you just left that way of thinking behind and didn't identify in any alternative way, or?
I mean, I don't tend to put labels on it, but certainly much more agnostic. I don't feel like there's not anything beyond our understanding, or even some sort of, I use the word so carefully, but some sort of God. I don't know. I'm not here to answer that question. I think there are people smarter than me that have been trying to answer it for millennia, and I'm certainly open to it. If a paper comes out tomorrow that says, "Oh, we've figured out what God is," I will happily read that. But yeah, I've just kind of surrendered. I think more agnostic. I feel like atheism can sometimes toe that line of also being dogmatic, and I just sort of wanted to step back away from that.
Yeah, and there are different definitions of or different ways people use the word atheist. So some say it's an active belief there is no God. Other people say it's just the absence of a belief in God, which describes me. Sometimes I describe myself as an extreme agnostic because, I'm sort of with you, right? If there was some experiments at the Large Hadron Collider or some other reliable source of evidence that demonstrated the existence of a God, then I would shift my credences in that direction. So, I never close off a door to a possibility 100% because I want to be open to the evidence. But at the same time, I'm quite extreme agnostic. I think the likelihood is extremely low, but there's still a tiny. I think it's nice to have that humility to conceptually be open to the idea. If the evidence changes, we should change our minds. But
yeah, I mean, there's research too that shows being open-minded gives you a better quality of life. Certainly, as I get older, I feel like it's more valuable. As a parent, it feels more valuable. So, not holding on, I feel like any real strong belief can be problematic.
Yeah, agree. I think dogma is a problem whether you claim, a supernatural inspiration or a scientific inspiration. If you're trapped in a one way of thinking, it's a problem regardless. Yeah. So often this part of the conversation centers on religion just because it's the sort of most obvious example of thinking about the natural versus the supernatural, or choices about what to believe. But as you've hinted at already, that's not the only question when we're thinking about what to believe and how to believe. So there are some really interesting sort of adjacent worlds around thinking through spirituality or thinking through other forms of mysticism or things that go beyond the strictly natural. And I won't make you retell the story here because people should go and listen to the spirituality episode you did with your experiences with David Wolfe and sort of living in a world there. But it strikes me, I guess there are a couple of questions I was interested in exploring with you around this idea of what to believe, because it strikes me that there's a whole world of possible beliefs in that space, and many of them start out as a sort of well-meaning sense of interconnectedness and a sort of sense of holism and maybe a warm reverence for nature and a sort of generosity of spirit and an open-mindedness. So they start out in a positive, warm place. But with some people, and I think David may have ended up being one of those people, there's a sort of slippery slope, whether through audience capture or financial incentives or some other thing going on in their minds that leads them into ending up selling, scam supplements that don't work, or promoting anti-vax rhetoric, or believing in QAnon lizard pedophile conspiracy theories, right? So I guess my first question is, what's the right amount of open-mindedness? And the second question, which I shouldn't ask together, but I'm going to because I think they sort of fit, is how do we judge when something goes from being open-minded, positive, maybe something fun and interesting that makes people feel good, to something that might actually start to be dangerous? How do we, what's your sense from the experiences you've had of how to judge that balance?
Tough questions. That's really interesting. I mean, are there degrees of open-mindedness, or is it just that you're either open or you're not, and then you have to use the empirical data and even your gut feeling on stuff to know whether or not that's the right thing? I mean, I spoke on the Conspirituality podcast of one of my first experiences with David when I finally moved out to San Diego to start running the company, he was like, okay, sit down, I've got to show you something. And it was this moon landing conspiracy video. And I didn't get up and walk out. I kept an open mind, but I was just dumbfounded. I mean, there's just so much information that shows that it happened. And what does this even matter? What does this have to do with my health? And what does this have to do with his business? And not that we're wasting time on it. I think any kind of exploration into anything that has some merit, some questions is worthwhile. But yeah, I don't know that there's a degree of open-mindedness. I think we've got to hear people out if we want to be compassionate. I mean, yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, if someone comes over and tells me we need to engage in some violence, I mean, I don't know how long I'm going to listen to that before I shut it down. Like, let's go smash whatever, the streets in Hollywood to protest vaccines and damage property. I mean, I'm not obviously not going to partake. And how much of that am I going to listen to? Probably not very much. So I think there are, I guess maybe there are degrees. I don't know. I'm struggling with this question. To me, it feels like you've got to be open, and you kind of know, I guess, within a short period of time, how much you want to give to that question, or how much time you want to focus on that. But I think being open is important, and a lot of times people say they're open-minded, but really they're listening just to respond. They're just waiting their turn. And it's not really, are you listening to let that other person be heard? Because sometimes people are just figuring stuff out themselves. I mean, I'm quite certain David does believe in the moon landing hoax, but perhaps it was just sharing because it's his way of saying, I don't trust a lot of authority, and there are things I have questions on. So you never know, I guess, really where things are stemming from, but being open, I think, is important. And what was the other part of the question?
Well, it was the right amount of open-mindedness, and you sort of pushed back on that and said, okay, maybe there isn't. There is just open-mindedness. You're either open or closed. But the other thing was, how do we judge where it starts to go from something that's harmless and sort of fun and people enjoy it to there's a danger here?
Yeah, I mean, where is that turning point? I don't know. I mean, I think back to when I was working with David, and there were people that were like not doing vaccines, and it felt like, well, there's no real threat, right? Polio has been eradicated, measles have been eradicated. So we thought it just felt kind of harmless. But fast forward to having my own child, to a global pandemic, I think your tolerance changes depending on the situation. I mean, and I don't know that these people know when it gets difficult. And I was very much I wasn't necessarily out there like anti-vax like David and some of those other people, but I wasn't standing up in those retreats or events and, absolutely putting my fist down that vaccines are critical. It was just kind of like not really an issue. I'd be so curious to know how many people have changed their mind from maybe being in that same space as I was, where it was just kind of like, he doesn't believe in vaccines, to each his own kind of thing. At the time, I mean, that's kind of how it was, right? It was like, you do it, you don't do it, move on with your life. Government wasn't so concerned about it. I mean, here in California, you could get an exemption at school if you wanted. Things have drastically changed, not just on vaccines, but lots of these other things that you mentioned, selling these products that may or may not work, and obviously taking money from people. So I don't know that there's one defining moment where the open-mindedness leads to, I mean, do we call it corruption? Do we call it just poor judgment? I'm not sure, but I mean, maybe that's the little bit of woo-woo that's still in me that says you do have to trust your gut on some of these things. And I'm not saying that's the be all end all. I very much prefer to have science in my corner, but I also feel like sometimes you can just tell when something is not a good not a good direction to go.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't expecting you to have the perfect, easy answer. Those are super hard questions. And I like the way you talked about, in a way, it is a choice just to be open-minded or not. And we, of course, should be open-minded. But I guess another way I think of it is as a bit of a spectrum. So on the one extreme, there's just denial, right? I'm refusing to believe anything. On the other extreme is total gullibility. I will believe anything that is suggested to me, even without evidence. And it does seem that there is a sort of middle ground of open, it's almost like being so open-minded you'll just believe anything, even if it's unsubstantiated. That's sort of what I mean by being too open-minded. It's like, whereas it does seem like there's this middle ground where we need to be open-minded, but then grant credences or have beliefs that are based on, as much as we can, as much as we're able to, weighing the evidence fairly. And we'll never do that perfectly because there's lots of different evidence. And there's, as you said earlier on, there's loads of different people's perspectives we need to bear in mind. We'll reason in different ways and we all have biases and flaws. But at least trying as far as we can to honestly weigh the evidence and appreciate it seems to be that sort of middle ground open-mindedness. And one of the interesting things is how many people who fall down that sort of rabbit hole or that pipeline that we were talking about before seem to be able to do both extremes of the spectrum at the same time. So they will have absolute denial on one thing and total gullibility on the other, which I find quite interesting because it is almost like a balance. To have total denial of one thing, you need to be totally gullible about the opposite, and it can get out of whack. And the that skepticism of authority, I think, is a classic example, because if you're totally trusting of authority, and in authority I mean the establishment of science as well, that's a mistake, right? Because science and authority, they're human enterprises that are flawed, and they have mistakes, and they have biases, and they're warped by motivations, and nothing's perfect. So of course they're imperfect. But to respond to that by having, completely abandoning the value of any authority or institution or science, and instead believing things that are completely unfounded, seems to be to jump to the other extreme. So I don't think there is an easy answer, right? But I guess this is what I'm trying to get at with this right amount of open-mindedness, the balance between gullibility and denial that finds this sort of middle ground of skepticism and weighing things based on the evidence. I guess that's why, what I aspire towards, but it's not a perfect answer. It's not an easy balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked about that on Conspirituality about David, with him leveraging science when it kind of supported his narrative.
Yeah.
And but then just totally slamming it when it didn't. And I mean, I think we all do that in life to some degree. I mean, maybe that is just the human conundrum, and that we have to kind of, stand for something, or we kind of fall for everything. And so we draw these little lines in the sand, and some of them certainly are based on consensus that science is generally okay. And then on the flip side, that it's not, that it is a big conspiracy. And it just, my feeling is that's just way too much effort and time to ruin people's lives. And, things like vaccines causing all this damage. I mean, they could put stuff in the water, they could put stuff in the air. Why is it like this voluntary shot that's supposed to save your life that is going to ruin everything? I don't know. I think drawing these lines gets, it's a way, I guess it's a defense mechanism. It's kind of like gossip. If you've ever researched gossip, which I have, is this way to kind of keep the tribal community safe. Like if you felt that the chief was somehow sick or in danger or whatever, it'd be like, let's talk about it. Let's make sure that we all know what's going on so that we can kind of keep ourselves and our families safe. And that's where this gossip, talking behind others' backs, kind of originated. So it is this defense mechanism, right? It's this tool that we used to really protect those we care about. Obviously, it has evolved to this terrible behavior, but I think it's very much the same with these different beliefs and even these conspiracy theories, is that we use them unconsciously to defend ourselves from whatever perceived or unperceived threat there is that we think we need protection from. And so I think a lot of it is very much in that same vein, is that these extremes are really just narratives that are this kind of programmed biological function of self-preservation.
Yeah. And I think there's also a strong dose of, group identity markers in there as well. That's one way we show loyalty and we bind together in groups is by shared commitment to, beliefs, whether or not they're well founded. So yeah, that's fair. And I guess the key is really no one can escape from these things, right? We're all sort of evolved apes with roughly the same sort of stuff going on in our heads. So the question for my mind isn't about whether we can totally perfectly erase all these biases. It's just not possible. No one thinks perfectly and critically and clearly. It's not, but we can, at least if we have enough awareness and motivation mentally to try and be aware of those biases and try and correct them, rather than just going all in with the blinkers on. I guess that's something we can all aspire to. But
it's the self-awareness, I think, is key, in knowing that you don't know everything, and that and keeping that open mind.
Doubt and humility has to be absolutely essential. So let me try and summarize what you've told me, which is it feels like you use a naturalistic approach generally to working out what to believe and what's real. You try and weigh evidence. At the same time, you're very open-minded to different perspectives and points of view, and you recognize they may not reconcile, and different people will see things in very different ways. And you're also open, at least conceptually, to the idea there might be something beyond the natural world, but you're going to you want to see some evidence before you choose to believe in those things. Is that a sort of fair summary? So it feels like I think broadly so. Naturalistic in that sort of sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to the second big question, which is, I guess, about ethics. So one of the classic challenges for someone who doesn't have a religious worldview is, well, if you don't have, a God telling you what to do, or you don't have a religious book with a series of rules, and you're not going to go to heaven or hell afterwards, what do good and bad or right and wrong even mean to you? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that question. How do you think about ethics and right and wrong and good and bad in just very general terms? And again, how has that shifted over your life?
And
does it come back to Bob Dylan?
I think it does. It has certainly shifted. I mean, I'll say I don't think you need religion to know good from bad. I think there's been studies on this, and I think Sam Harris talks a lot about this, that we're born with a moral code, even if we don't define it. And I saw it as a parent with a newborn, and just watching her develop, and she's being raised vegan, but after age like 4, when she kind of really could think for herself, she chose it rather than just living in a house where we're not eating animals. So, and we're not a religious household. So I think you kind of can come to that without the fear of heaven or hell or the reward of heaven. So
why do you think she made that choice? Because it links into the second part of this question, which is who matters too. Because I think one theme that runs through most religious ethics and non-religious ethics is an idea of compassion and caring about others. It almost seems a truism that that's what ethics is about. If it's not about our concern for others, I'm not sure it even deserves to be called ethics. But what do you think was driving thinking about that? If you asked her now, if we brought her on and said, why don't you eat animals? What would she say is the reason?
She would probably say, that's disgusting, and make a noise and run out of the room. But because I was always very matter of fact she started to realize early on why we avoided whole sections of the supermarket. And when one day she pointed to something in the deli case and asked what it was, and I said, well, that used to be a pig's, stomach or back or whatever. And we always say, or we did always say when she was young, when she would say, well, how come I don't eat meat, but my best friend, this person who I absolutely love and want to spend time with, does? And my simple answer was, well, we know some things about animals that they might not know yet. And so for us, that's made the decision to not eat them. And I mean, I guess that's potentially going to change as she becomes a teenager and spends more time out with her friends who are alone, who are going to be eating animals, or she just wants to annoy me, which is entirely a possible trajectory for that. But she seems very much to just understand that basic level of compassion, and that it's different than when I went vegetarian in the many, many millions of years ago. I mean, she can walk down the street and get like 20 different vegan meals without even any stress or discomfort or going out of her way at all. It's so much easier. So I think because the food is so delicious and it is so abundant, at least here in Los Angeles, she's never felt left out. She's never felt like she's had to sacrifice. I mean, her friends, or I saw at her birthday a couple weeks ago, one of her friends was like going on and on about how they had all these burgers or something at a cabin they had been like grilling, and the friend asked her directly, like, don't you find it hard to be vegan? And she was just like confused by the question. Like, what are you talking about? It's like, I'm standing here, I'm taller than you, I'm stronger than you,
Yeah.
So I think she loves her cats. I mean, they are her world. And I think she's really come to see no difference between them and a chicken or a fish or a pig. It could change. She's only 9, but that's the choice she's made. Her dad is not vegan. And when she spends time with him, I mean, there's animal products all around, and he cooks vegan for her, and she just carries on. So I was really curious if that relationship, once he started to eat animal products again, if that would change her relationship with food, and it hasn't.
Yeah. Thank you. That's fascinating. And I think, I'd echo what's run through that, which is this sense that we don't need a supernatural or a religious worldview or anybody else to tell us how to be ethical. It's just, in a simple sense, a choice to be compassionate or not. And I think that runs richly through a naturalistic way of thinking about ethics as much as it might run through other ways of thinking about ethics. And that's partly why I summarized the Sentientism thing as evidence and reason and compassion for all sentient beings, because I think that idea of compassion should be central to any sort of ethical system, whether you want to be a utilitarian or a deontologist or a feminist care ethic or virtue ethicist or contractarian, whatever, the philosophers can go and philosophize, but the essence has to be, let's have compassion. And I'd suggest we should have compassion for all sentient beings. So it was fascinating to hear your sort of daughter's journey through that. But what was your journey to expanding that scope of compassion? How early did that happen? How difficult was it? And what were the sort of steps along the way?
I think it was something that happened early on. For me, I kind of tell my story as like I was always vegan. I didn't have a word for it. It wasn't until like my teens that I like came out of the refrigerator, is how I kind of define it. I think it's very much tied to those questions I had at Hebrew school, and just around these beliefs around me that didn't line up. I was just absolutely disgusted by a lot of the food in my upbringing, where everyone else in my family's chowing down and eating stuff. I mean, things like not just chicken legs, which were like the grossest thing to me, but ice cream. I didn't like butter. Things that a lot of kids, cheese was like, I would peel most of it off my pizza. These were things that most kids lived on. It was all they would eat. I mean, there was a period where like I had to go see a psychologist because I thought I had like some eating disorder at like 7 years old. And I don't think that was it. I mean, I had a healthy appetite. Some of my worst memories are of sitting there with this animal food on my plate that I didn't even make the connection. I didn't know that a burger was coming from the same thing as ice cream. I had no real understanding. I mean, it was just not really talked about. There was like one segment, I think, on Sesame Street where they show like a cow being milked and that being like trucked to the store, and it's in the kids' bottle, but it wasn't something we really talked about. They didn't really teach that in school. But so some of my worst memories from childhood were, I mean, even trauma, like a teacher making me sit at the lunch table till I ate a piece of bread with butter on it. And I like had to like suck it down, holding my nose because it just tasted so offensive. But some of my best memories were the opposite. Like I have a really great memory of like the first backyard tomato that we ate one summer, and it was just like the most delicious, juicy, sweet, tangy artichokes, pole beans, just general like beans that had grown in the garden. Some of my best memories, and it was all around fruits and vegetables. And so it was a real struggle.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it sounds like that initial trigger was maybe more one of sort of a disgust in like an emotional sense, rather than you hadn't yet made the explicit connection to what it meant for the animals that had been
Not at
farmed.
all.
But you just, for some reason, there was a sense of disgust or sort of a taste rejection of those things.
I mean, it was maybe something intuitive. I don't know, but it felt like it was a problem. It was a problem until I was in my teens that I couldn't reconcile this need to eat and not having anybody talk to me about options and this disgust for food. And it was like in high school when I started dating a guy who's still my best friend, and his family is Turkish. And I would spend a lot of time at the house, and they would have just the most, I mean, they were not vegetarian at all, but so much vegetable forward food, and like beans with lemon and parsley and tabbouleh and I mean, it's just like it completely cracked me open to
like there's options here. I can
I don't have to just eat burgers. I mean, maybe it was just my parents were terrible cooks. I don't know, but that's what really saved me and made me. I mean, I had those early like moments of loving certain vegetables and certain foods as a child, but I had never really been exposed to healthy plant-based food, and that really changed me. But as I got older, I mean, so I had this kind of history of being really grossed out. Like I never would eat eggs ever. Like my whole family's chowing down all kinds of eggs, salad, fried eggs, and I never ever liked them. And then in like 7th grade, my best friend and I tried to go vegetarian, but there were no options. It was French fries and salad and cheese pizza, but I didn't really like cheese, so our parents wouldn't allow us to just starve, and it was kind of like, you're going to eat or we're going to force it on you. So I kind of went back and forth eating, and there were some things I would eat, like some white breast chicken stuff or whatever, or like some hot dogs. I mean, I could eat some of that stuff, but it was never really pleasurable. And then by my late teens, I think I had heard the word vegan, and there was the Smiths album Meat is Murder, and it sort of started like all the stars aligned where I realized, like, that's why I say I had this aha moment where I was like, oh, I'm vegan. Like it actually makes sense now, like all of this stress and trauma that had come from certain foods, while the other ones just were like a pure delight. So I went vegan and never looked back.
And was that the point where you made the ethical connection as well, in terms of suffering, death, exploitation? Or
I think I made that
sort of intuitively had that already. Yeah.
In 7th grade, when we tried to go vegetarian, and we did for like a couple weeks, and then our parents were like, no. And it was again that like, okay, well, if I don't eat, I'm going to die. And if I want to explore who I am and what matters to me, then I have to eat to survive. And that's where I look at my daughter and I think, gosh, I would have given anything, as much as I don't like the Beyond Burger. I would give anything to have them on every street corner like
Can
she
you imagine?
does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think I kind of went back to eating meat after that couple weeks, and avoiding it when I could. But I think that was when I really made that ethical connection.
Thank you. And jumping back a bit, did Hebrew School talk to you about non-human animal ethics at all? Did that suggest a way humans should think about non-humans? Was that not such a factor?
I don't remember. Yeah. I don't remember that. I feel like I would remember if that came up, but
yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. So there's two other questions I had here in the sort of who matters section, because there's this almost this spectrum that some people choose from. There's anthropocentrism, where we focus on humans. There's sentiocentrism, where we care about all beings that can suffer, which good shorthand for that is animals. There might be some questions around the edges, but that's where I am, and I think you are as well. Even within that, there's a challenge of thinking about all non-human animals. So, most people are on the same page with companion animals. Certainly vegans are on the same page with farmed animals. But then there's some more challenging things about how should we think about wild animal suffering, and wild animal suffering, both that's caused by humans, but then wild animal suffering that has nothing to do with humans whatsoever. And how do we think about that? So I guess that's one question, is how do you think about wild animal suffering as a phenomenon, as a problem, as a thing?
Like a lion chasing down a deer kind of thing, or just the injured lion?
It could be. Writ large, the number of sentient animals in the wild is way bigger than those in our farm. So it's almost impossible to estimate. But the estimates are something like a quintillion or a sextillion, maybe, of sentient beings out there living in the wild. So the main causes of suffering, yes, it will include predation, but there's also starvation, climate problems, freezing heat, disease. There's all sorts of different reasons why wild animals might suffer, I guess. So I guess the simple question is, does your compassion include wild animals as well as farmed animals?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Who doesn't feel sympathy for seeing a squirrel or something on the side of the road? I think it's kind of shocking to me that you can get sympathy and responses from people to that while they've got a burger in their hand. But
it's amazing, isn't it? I find it bizarre that people can absolutely gush with emotion and be willing to really make personal sacrifices and invest time and money to look after, as you say, a squirrel or a duck or a local wild animal they come across,
or their own pets while they're eating. So yeah. But I think the real question for me, there's always suffering. That's the nature of life. But how much of it is caused by human fault or neglect, or are the diseases coming because of things we're doing to the climate, that we're doing to their food sources? Are whales being trapped in fishing gear? all of that is it's a pretty big deal. I would imagine it's a pretty large number of the suffering is because of human action. So there, I certainly feel some responsibility as a human that has a voice. That's part of what Ethos is for, is to kind of remind people that our choices matter.
Yeah.
But suffering that happens because a squirrel foolishly falls off the wire, although I guess that's our wire that we okay, let's say it falls off a tree limb because he's not paying attention. I'm going to feel bad. I'm going to help him up, I guess. But I think I was taking a hike yesterday in my neighborhood, and I saw this kid on his skateboard just like completely wipe out, like so bad, like tumbled down the street. He was fine. He had some scrapes. He had a helmet. He was okay. But, suffering happens. Like, he was in a joyful moment. He's a teenager. He's having fun on a Wednesday afternoon, just like probably delaying his homework or whatever. But, accidents happen, and I think nature is not exempt from that, but where humans are the cause of that suffering directly or indirectly, I feel a huge amount of guilt over it, but guilt that I feel like I've turned into action. And I think that's the most important thing, is that we can't just sit around and feel like we've screwed the world. Let's be self-indulgent or not, or just shut off and not do anything about it. So for me, it's everything I do is about trying to make the world a better place, or that we're at least more aware of how much of it. I mean, I didn't build power lines. I'm not responsible for fishing nets, but I am a human that has a voice to be able to help change that.
Yeah, you might not be responsible, but you have the opportunity to maybe help in various ways. And that's what we'll come on to next. And the final question I had for you about this who matters thing, before we move off the philosophy and get back into the real world, is if we go from anthropocentrism to this sentiocentrism, where we care about all sentient, you can go further. So you can go into biocentrism, where you might care about, for example, if we assume that plants aren't sentient, you could care about grass and trees and so on in the biosphere. Or you could go even further than that into ecocentrism, which is caring about the earth as Gaia, ecosystems, habitats, even rocks, rivers, trees, stuff that isn't living at all. And it feels to me as if there's quite often a correlation between people who go to those really expansive ways of thinking about the biosphere and the ecosphere, and quite a lot of the thinking in the spirituality and the wellness world that you spend a lot of time in, because there seems to be this drive to have this sense of interconnectedness with all of these different systems, a sense of oneness, maybe, often a reverence for nature. So how do you think about going even beyond sentience and thinking about plants, rocks, rivers, and ecosystems as objects of moral concern or compassion directly?
Well, I think it's that everything is connected. I mean, I think that's where psychedelics are a great tool. I mean, they can really illuminate that. I mean, I've seen it firsthand in the jungle of Colombia, where like everything was, in my experience there, drinking ayahuasca, was that everything was completely connected. The rocks, the trees, the sky, there was no separation. And and I mean, I don't think you can in the real world live like tiptoeing around to not, rocks are meant to be stepped on or climbed, and plants in my worldview are meant to be eaten. But I think that there is the connection, is that, it's all part of this floating mass that has decided to come to life in all of these different ways. And maybe the rock isn't as crucial a life form as a blue whale, but it all serves its purpose in a way, and we're seeing the signs left and right that the more we think we can just like pluck any one thing out and discard it or throw it away, that becomes incredibly problematic. And everything except for mosquitoes, I'm not really sure where they fit into all of this, but I think everything else really has has some value, whether we know it or not.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think I'd share that view as well. And it's interesting because I think you can get to it through at least a couple of different routes. You can take that more, as far as I understand it, ayahuasca or related hallucinogenics can be genuinely mind-blowing, give you a really rich, deep, visceral sense of that connectedness. But I think as a boring, naturalistic person like me who's never experimented with those things, I think I can also see that we are all connected just as a matter of physics, right? Ultimately, we're all atoms and quarks. We are all the same stuff at the root level, whatever that is, and we absolutely are connected, right? You can just look at the relationships and the connections. And I think that's the way I think about it, is that I'm quite strict about this moral scope thing, and I don't think there's anything ethically wrong in necessarily cutting a blade of grass in itself, because I don't think the blade of grass suffers. It doesn't care about itself. So I don't think we need to care about it in the same way as cutting a pig is a deep ethical wrong, because the pig suffers and cares about itself and doesn't want to be cut. And that's why we should care too. But at the same time, because of the interconnectedness of all of these ecosystems and environment and the non-sentient and the non-living stuff, we need to have a rich consideration for how all of those things to plug together too, and not just a sort of very narrow instrumental approach that says, look, this is what us humans need, and those things are just useful to us. And I guess the one thing that frustrates me a little bit, and I find this in the environmentalism movement generally, I think it is the center of gravity of the environmental movement today, and also in much of the spirituality and the wellness world, is there's this sense of a really rich, generous compassion for the entire planet and all of the interconnected ecosystems, but a convenient carving out of compassion for many of the sentient beings. So people will say, well, I have an ecocentric concern for the planet and the ecosystems and how everything plugs together, but I will conveniently not have compassion for farmed animals.
And often eat meat,
as an example, or for many of the animals in the world. People will care about species and population levels and those sorts of concepts much more than they will about the well-being or the suffering of individual sentient beings. And so I find that a little frustrating. I'm like, okay, if you want to go further and think about those connections, that's great, but we still have to have some special role for the beings that can actually experience suffering, and that they have to have some central position where we'd have compassion for them.
Yeah, I don't know if you read Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma and his books after, and he kind of explored a lot of that, and he's very much would consider himself, I guess, an environmentalist. I don't know. I mean, he very much cares about the world, and he came to a place where he was like, I'm okay with killing an animal to eat it. He's not okay with the factory farm situation. I think he's got more experience than most people as what that looks like. And I don't agree. I'm not okay with it in really any situation, but I understand where he came from, where he went and he hunted I think a boar for his meal with some people that had done it before, and kind of came to that. And I mean, if you look at some of these tribal communities that also are known to use psychedelics as a way to kind of resolve a lot of their own questions and heal and connect with the earth. I mean, a lot of them are meat eaters, or keep animals for dairy and things like that, or eggs. So I kind of sometimes can't help but wonder, do they know something that I don't know? I mean, do they have a communication with that animal on some deep level that gives permission? I don't believe that personally. And I do agree that a blade of grass or a leaf of kale is completely different than the life of an animal. I mean, you can barely pet my cat the wrong direction and she will give you so much grief. So
very clear communication.
And I mean, and maybe that's just a function of the urgency that the environmentalist is, that there's so much going on and there's so much that needs addressed. And because the animal part is such a deep philosophical reckoning. I mean, I've seen it over and over. It makes people so uncomfortable. I'm sure you've seen it. So that kind of broad stroke, like, let's just save the planet, let's get rid of the plastic. It's like an entry point to that dialogue. And I believe, and this is me clinging to a belief system on one side of that spectrum, that we will evolve to eat far fewer animals, not just out of necessity for the planet, but out of a moral obligation and understanding. And I think we're just not there yet. I mean, we can barely agree about how to handle a global pandemic when millions of people and loved ones have died. So can we get to a point where we have that a similar level of compassion for animals? I think eventually, but I see where environmentalists are struggling is to just have any point of entry. Businesses are making big leaps every single day, and that's moving the needle, but there's still so much to do. So I mean, I don't know if I'm defending them. I just feel like I understand that it's unfortunate that animals are maybe not the top priority for a lot of people right now. I think we're in just such a a free fall in terms of like where we're going as a species, where we're going as a planetary community, and are we becoming that? We've got war happening right now that in one part of the world, we've still got, I got an alert on my phone that I was maybe exposed to COVID. I got it this morning. So, I mean, we've just got so many problems that are people, do they have the bandwidth to check themselves on their moral conscious about animals? I don't know.
One thing I think, we'll probably come on to next is that gives me more hope is that I think there are win-wins here as well, because of many of the problems you've talked about, maybe not ending war, but whether it's pandemic, the climate crisis, pollution, zoonotic disease, many of those things would actually be addressed even in selfish human terms if we bring an end to animal agriculture. But the only other thing I'd say, because I can also have some degree of empathy for of course justifications for harming animals that come from a survival need. I can recognize the sort of cultural resonance in many animal farming practices, traditional and modern. You talk to a rancher in the US Midwest and they'll tell you a story about culture and identity, right, as much as anything else. So I can sense that, and I understand what's going on there. But the thing that cuts through in every case for me is the salience of the perspective of the victim. And whatever the rationale is, whether it's a tribal custom, or it's someone in a more modern context, or it's someone who's taken ayahuasca and says, I'm connected and this animal is giving itself to me. I think if you honestly consider the perspective of the victim, it's highly unlikely that they will agree with that perspective as they fight for their lives and they run away and they scream in pain. So that doesn't make the thing easy, but I think the important thing is, think about those contexts and those justifications, but we cannot erase the perspective of the victim, because I think it is always a present issue and a present negative in almost any one of those situations. But it doesn't mean there's easy answers. Fortunately, there are some easy answers, like ending industrial animal agriculture, which we should just do like
just
that.
turn it off. So I mean, I would love to see that too.
Let's come on to this final question, because we're getting into it already. Before I let you get on with your day, which is almost as difficult, but it is a bit more grounded in the real world. How can we make a better future? So some of my guests talk about sort of utopian visions, or maybe dystopian visions about where we might end up. Others like to talk about more pragmatic ways of driving positive change. And it would be fascinating to hear about, your own life's work and what you're doing with Ethos now, about how you think you can pull these levers to get us going in a better direction for us and other sentient beings.
Yeah, I think it is dystopia and utopia a little bit at the same time. Yeah. You got to look for the good things. I mean, I think, but we can't ignore the negatives, and so that makes it a challenge for all of us. But yeah, I think I'm eternally the optimist, and I've seen so much progress since I've been on the planet. And even though things have gotten a lot worse in some areas, there's a lot that's gotten better. And I think we're still, like I just said, I think we're still kind of sorting it out. And there's so much to us kind of growing up as a race, and figuring out who we want to be and how we want to enjoy this planet. And I recently interviewed I think 4 or 5 Gen Zs. And I was completely shocked and blown away at how just aware and intelligent and capable they are. And
always gives me hope.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I've got a 9-year-old Gen Alpha. They also are pretty incredible. And they have some big, heavy decisions and choices that they're going to have to make. I mean, they are going to be the ones in charge, and I think they're going to be okay, but not without a lot of suffering and sacrifice along the way, whether that's farm animals or these diseases that are wiping out millions of humans as well. So at Ethos, we're really focused on just telling these stories in the gentlest way possible and shining light on some of the victories, but most important, giving people choices and letting them know that they can still shop the way they want to shop, still eat the way they want to eat, but with these choices that are better. I mean, one example just this last week was Stella McCartney's Paris Fashion Week show, which grand scheme with all the suffering in the world feels a little indulgent. I get it, but it was her most sustainable show yet. It was 87% sustainable. And her big comment on it was, I don't want people to know that it was sustainable. I don't want them to be able to tell. She had a purse made from grape skin leather that had, I believe, a chain made out of mycelium mushroom root. The cotton was all regenerative, grown cotton, which helps the soil to better absorb carbon. She had these rhinestones that were used without any solvent or toxins. I mean, so, you've got Bella Hadid walking down the runway in this stunning outfit that is completely giving back to the planet and taking care of the planet. There's no real sacrifice there. And I think, we, I'm sure both know the same things are happening with food. I mean, you've got burgers that taste just like burgers. You've got the whole cultivated meat sector that is about to see big regulatory approval in Europe and in the US, and brands that say that they've been able to reach price parity. So you've got all of these options that are just starting to trickle in. I mean, we're just now figuring out how to fix fashion, how to fix food. So that's something we're really focused on telling, because I think people still feel like, oh, I have to bring my own tote bags to the supermarket. I can't use straws. I can't eat meat. They feel like it's this big sacrifice. And I think there are so many individuals and scientists and companies out there working to prove you don't have to really change anything. You just eat this burger instead of that burger, but you still have a delicious burger. Or you just use this purse instead of that purse, and you still have a luxury, beautiful bag that doesn't contain any animal skin, doesn't contain any toxic chemicals that are, poisonous to you, to animals, to the planet. So I think we're really just at the beginning of that. And it's just been decades of kind of organizing our thoughts and organizing that plan of action. And it's only going to get more organized and more easy.
Yeah, that's a hopeful vision, because there's this sort of classic dynamic of there's a bad thing happening. There's a sort of philosophical moral argument for why you should change, and you will have to sacrifice to do that. That's quite a tough trade to get, busy, stressed people to engage with. And some people do, right? Many of my guests are, weirdos in this sense, which I mean in the most generous possible sense, you included, right? Because there's that sort of philosophical commitment, that ethical commitment has driven you to make practical changes. But we just know that's too slow. So I sort of share your hope that if we can find a way of providing choices for people that just feel like good choices, right? They're free. They're not sacrifices. They're freeing. They're positive. You can step into them. They might be cheaper, tastier, more fun to wear. And, and you get the buzz from knowing you're helping with a sustainability challenge and you're not contributing to, harming sentient beings. That's a positive option. But individuals need those choices in front of them. And the easier those choices are, and the more available those choices are, the quicker change can happen. And I sort of share that hope that really feels like we're at the start of a major systemic shift in those consumer choices. And, I don't know if this is what Stella McCartney meant, but, one day, hopefully we won't really need to use the word sustainable, because just everything will be, right? It will be the assumption. I've even joked before that, one day we won't need the word vegan, right?
Yeah.
Because it will be so obvious. Just that we don't have a word now for not being a cannibal, right? Because our social default is so strong in that space that you don't need a word for going the other way. So I do think that will change. But the other thing I was interested in, my understanding of your work with Ethos is it's focused on, I guess, the consumer primarily and helping them think about those choices and moving through them. What do you think about the other levels of, or the levers of change we can pull, whether it's institutional policy, law, getting the UN to shift from a universal declaration of human rights to a universal declaration of sentient rights, or, those sort of more institutional levers? Do you think how do you balance that individual choice versus institutional change thing? And does ethos try and play into that latter story as well, or is it more about individual consumption choices?
I think they are very connected. I think institutional changes come about because of individual changes and really respond to what, governments for the people, by the people. So those changes happen. I mean, and I think we're already seeing that. We're definitely more focused on the consumer side so that people can feel empowered and make those decisions. But because of consumer demand, companies are changing how they view their roles and their responsibilities. They're changing their offerings. They're changing their bylaws. I mean, they're a little bit every day. And I definitely see a time where there's widespread institutional change and policy change. We're seeing some of that. I mean, California just banned sale of combustion engines. I mean, so I think it's not till 2035, but changes like that really signal that consumers are open and willing. And I think we are. We know government and even within business, that stuff takes a while. Like you were saying, like, let's just shut down factory farms. McDonald's would go out of business tomorrow if all of a sudden it had no access to beef or pork or chicken. Companies are struggling to keep up with that demand. I mean, they would have to take like every vegan nugget on the planet to fill their orders. Yeah. I'm not saying that justifies them continuing to sell that, but
should we give them a month or two to transition?
It's I think it's years, and I think that we look at they're all tied, right? Like, you don't think McDonald's affects your life. I don't think it affects my life, but it's this economic system that if they collapse, then so much collapses around it too. So we have to keep business kind of running as best we can. I mean, we're seeing the
jobs,
effects right
taxes, now. Whatever it is.
But as these options, become more readily available and scalable, and then there are policy changes that allow for or encourage the more frequent adoption of the sustainable choice, I think it's going to just become the norm. And it's, decades. I feel like by the end of my lifetime, I'll see a completely different world than what I imagined when I went vegan and vegetarian as a teenager. It will be all that and more. It's already more. Like, I was a couple weeks ago, my daughter wanted like vegan ice cream after school, and like we had a tough decision to make because there's like 5 vegan ice cream spots within a few blocks of each other, and I was like, what world am I living in? Like, I could never have dreamed that it would look like this, by this age of my life. And so if we've come this far, and I think it sometimes feels like it's moving so slow, but what's that saying? I think it's like attributed to C.S. Lewis that like day to day, nothing changes. But when you look back, like everything has changed, and there's so much that has shifted. And, being a longtime vegan and kind of, I share your philosophy. I would love to see it just eradicated tomorrow and more front and center. And I've become more patient with that. I've less the activist these days and more trying to just give people options, but seeing people who I never thought would say, I'm done with meat, or, I don't drink milk anymore, or whatever. It's just shocking to me. And what's also really shocking is the amount of flexitarianism, which I thought was just kind of this made up whatever. Like, I didn't really give it much credit. I thought it was kind of a cop out, but I've seen it a lot, particularly with my daughter's friends and families, and her best friend's family's favorite burger place. It just happens to be a vegan burger place here in LA. And like, I have not yet got in line at a coffee shop and heard a person order cow's milk, which is shocking to me. And I'm quite certain most of those people are not even vegan, but like oat milk is the default in Los Angeles right now. It just kind of blows my mind. So it's maybe flexitarianism is that foot in the door, and people are really open to it. And maybe they're more open to it than we even think. But there's just, you sit down at dinner. I was at a event last weekend, and it was like a catered event, and there wasn't a vegan option on the table, and I just thought it was so shocking. So if I'm a person who puts oat milk in my coffee, but I sit down at this dinner and all that's there is like chicken or pasta with cheese, like, and I'm hungry, I'm going to eat one of those things. I went and had the chef make me something special, but it was shocking that in LA there wasn't an option. But I see where if there are choices, people are going to make them for their health, for the planet, for the animals.
Yeah. And I share your view that all these different levers and levels of change are interconnected too. The one thing that frustrates me is when people use this institutional change story as an excuse for not making change themselves. So it's like, the top 7 corporations are the problem, or governments are the problem. So I don't need to make any change. So I can object to this system while continuing to fund it myself. Like, well, why are you doing that? But if we put that to one side, I think they are all richly connected, but partly because, as you say, the consumers that are reading and consuming ethos content, are thinking about better consumption decisions, and that ripples through corporations and drives change in its own right. But the people reading that aren't just consumers. They're also voters, and maybe standing for office, and maybe a staffer in a political office, and maybe a manager in a company, or maybe, drafting a policy document. All of the institutions we're talking about are made up of people who are also consuming your content. So, each individual can play all sorts of different roles as a consumer, and in the political sphere and the corporate sphere. And I think we underestimate how, rapidly those ripples flow out, and how much they pick up and connect. And as you said, it can feel like things are moving very slowly, but then you look back and you realize how much has changed. And I think you can also reach major tipping points too, where you get to a certain point, you're sort of 5% of the way there, 8% of the way there, 10% of the way there. And that's enough for it just to start to switch really quickly. And then we really will need, I'd love to have the problem of how we're going to manage the transition, because McDonald's is going to run out of pork. Wouldn't that be a great problem to have? But then, more people are thinking about those transition plans, and practically, how can we help not just have consumers with better choices, but have farmers and companies and food systems with better choices to switch as well, and help them through that transition. So yeah, it's a hopeful vision.
Well, look at a great example is Burger King recently tested some vegan pop-ups, and I think, where is it, Austria, Germany, somewhere over there, they're now defaulting to their vegan burger. I think and I think that's ongoing. I could be wrong, but when you come into the store, unless you specify meat, and I mean, that's about as forward looking as it gets in my mind. That
they're switching the default.
They're switching the default. So, like, is there a day where they're like, there's no more pork? I think that happens, and I think it happens that way, that slowly they add more, then slowly they switch it to the default, and then one day it's just like they discontinue anything. Like, well, we're pulling it off the menu, it doesn't sell anymore. And it's not necessarily a big to do. I mean, I'm sure for lots of people it will be a most emotional day, but I think that's how it happens. It's like you slowly start adding more, and it's just the same way too. If you want to eat healthy, you don't keep putting junk food on your plate, right? You keep adding more salad and more whole grains and beans till there's no more room for the fried chicken. And then one day it's not there at all. And it's just kind of like, oh yeah, I'm just eating healthier now. And I think Burger King, who would have thought that they would kind of jump out ahead as the big leader in this movement, but they've shown strong and continuous signs in that direction. And it seems like that seems the easiest way to do it. I mean, you can't just turn it off tomorrow. You've got to acclimate your audience to these new products and new tastes. And then you've got to kind of say, okay, see, you like it, it's the default, and then just slowly take the other stuff off the menu.
Agree. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And thank you again for what Ethos is doing to try and nudge us in that positive direction. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the conversation before I let you get on with your day? And also, how can people follow you and learn about your work and pick up with Ethos' content?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great way to start the day. We're at the-ethos.co. on Instagram. We're at Elevate Your Ethos. And you can find us on LinkedIn at the Ethos Co. and also on Twitter, the Ethos Co.
Brilliant. I'll include all of those links in the show notes. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a privilege to hear your sort of philosophical journey and to understand what you're doing to help make the world a better place. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thanks, Jill.
Likewise. Take care.
Take care. Stay in touch.